Welcome to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, Ciaran O'Connor. So my guest today is Bill Ottman. He is the co-founder of Minds.com, which is an open source social network. It seeks to become a suitable, usable alternative to the behemoth social networks like Facebook, Twitter, that critics, including, as I imagine Bill might agree, violate our privacy, mine our data, and degrade our discourse. The Minds platform, on the other hand, seeks to prioritize privacy, transparency, and free speech, and also financially incentivize certain kinds of content. Bill, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Ciaran.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. There's a lot of stuff I want to get into with you. Obviously, the very nature of social media is under scrutiny today in the era of COVID, the era of polarization, and the era of disinformation. Why don't we begin by telling our audience a little bit about what is Minds.com? Why did you co-found it, and where do you hope to take it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you gave a pretty good bird's eye view, but basically, we're called Minds, and originally it was all about creating a network that actually represents the people on it. So Minds, it's Minds. It's open source. Open source is beautiful in that it's sort of like this global collaborative project, and everyone's participating and contributing and helping make it what it is. And we have really tried to take that to a new level in terms of, like community ownership of the code, community ownership, owning your data. We're also community owned in the equity sense. So our original funding round was equity crowdfunding round where like over 1,500 members of our community raised $1 million. And and they're all now shareholders. So for an early stage company to have community ownership, I think is pretty rare and definitely meaningful, so that people have a stake in the future of the platform. And we're planning on doing that again. We want as many users on the site to have ownership as possible. So that's a big part of it. And then, rev share mechanisms as well. So look, if you don't treat creators, users with respect, I don't think that in this world you're going to last long, especially in the social sphere. So we're really taking this user first, creator first ethos and taking it as far as we can.
And so what differentiates Minds.com from Facebook and Twitter?
None of them are open source. They're all proprietary, closed source, secretive with all their algorithms and all that. So, and that's one of the worst parts about them, which most people don't really realize, because it's, they're talking about software, open source, closed source, proprietary. I don't really know what that means. Most people don't know why that's meaningful. So, like a broken record, I am constantly talking about the analogy with food. I mean, you want transparency around your food. You want to buy food that is telling you what's in it. And that has been a movement that has exploded in the last, couple decades, and for good reason. And so I think the same is starting to happen with apps, where people want to know what their apps are doing to them. And it's just it's an ethical issue. So there's that. We don't require any personal information. We're certainly not surveilling everybody to target ads at them. We do have a fun feature called Boost, where you earn tokens for your contributions, and then one token's worth 1,000 impressions. So you can trade your tokens in for more exposure on your content. But we're not like following you around everywhere you go in life in order to throw scary ads at you. But you will see promoted posts in your feed. But our feed is also reverse chronological, which is really important because, now whether you're on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook, whatever, your feed is, we don't know what the feed is. The feed is based on thousands of variables that we don't know because we don't have access. And they're basically showing us what they think we want to see as opposed to what we subscribe to. So you're missing a lot of stuff that you subscribe to. Now, look, there is an argument that, different algorithms can be good so that you can see like has the most engagement. And so we're not like anti-algorithm, but we do believe that by default, it should be reverse chronological unless the user changes it, because that is the free flow of information. The network is not curating your psychological experience on Minds. You have curated your own experience by subscribing to people. This is just, something that, you're cruising through your feed on these big networks. And every time the feed refreshes, it's making a very specific calculation, trying to predict you and manipulate you. So, yeah, I don't know.
So you're saying that minds.com feed, it's just, it gives equal weight to everyone's post. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Or if a post is getting, a ton of engagement, it doesn't get boosted to the top?
Not of your newsfeed. Like, we think that your newsfeed is yours. You should be the one deciding what you see. Now, different discovery feeds, trending feeds. Okay, yeah, that's fine. To have trending algorithms and different types of engagement algorithms. But what's scary, I mean, we used to have, we still have the pages, but like millions of followers over on Facebook. And we used to drive a ton of traffic to Minds from there. And then the organic reach was just like, plummeted down to like a few percent of like 1 million followers. We used to get 10,000 likes a post. Now we get like 100. So it's like, what? That is a broken contract to me. I mean, as a user who's spent years on Facebook, like I'll admit that. I mean, Facebook had tons of value, still has some, but it's so manipulative, and it's not a equal, fair, consensual relationship.
And so do you think that stems from people's numbness and the fact that there's not really a suitable alternative because they're such behemoths?
Right.
If you want to connect with all of your friends who are already on the platform, and you've sort of already accepted the fact that in today's world, these companies are going to get your data. I mean, who actually reads the terms of service when they sign up? Very few people. So people go ahead and click check, and then all of a sudden they might be surprised to learn how much of their private data has been essentially mined, not only to serve them ads, which I think people reflexively understand. Okay, I'm searching for a new car. All of a sudden I start seeing ads for cars. But also that Facebook is cultivating an echo chamber and basically curating your feed so that you're starting to burrow deeper and deeper into these own targeted interests and biases that over time really shape your worldview without you even really realizing it, if you think that what you're seeing is just the world as it really is.
Yeah, absolutely. And in echo chambers are really difficult to avoid regardless of what the algorithm is, because people will create their own naturally. But and we are working on sort of anti-echo chamber. I mean, the boost functionality is sort of an echo chamber breaker, because every like 15 posts you will see something that isn't related necessarily to anything that you've interacted with. It's just a boosted post from someone else in the community. So you will be exposed to different ideas that aren't necessarily in line with what you think. But the malicious thing about the feeds on these big networks is just that you don't know why you're seeing what you're seeing. And I mean, you're right. Like your personality is sort of years of doing this, years of scrolling through that feed, like your opinions will change, and not knowing why, and just being sort of subject to this engineering without transparency. It's one thing if they were like, hey, this is exactly what we're doing, and maybe you can change variables and whatnot. But yeah, and they say, oh, we're trying to limit misinformation and what, but it's all just PR posturing. At the end of
Right.
the day, it's all about transparency, and they're just not.
Yeah, and I think they exist in a marketplace, and they're a publicly traded company, and I think there's enormous pressure on the leadership of these companies not only to be responsive to public pressure and pressure from elected officials, but also pressure from the bottom line. And I think a lot of people have shown that oftentimes the best way to make money is to violate privacy as much as possible, to simply glean as much data as possible so that you can do this kind of like advanced demographic and psychographic and behavioral based content tailoring. So I guess it takes a certain form of ethical leadership to kind of say no to those impulses. But at the same time, unless you're Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey, you're going to want to follow the company line, or you might find yourself out of a job.
Well, I don't know if that's the case so much with Zuckerberg, but certainly Dorsey. I mean, he's a big Bitcoin supporter. He is clearly a little bit more. I mean, even actually Zuckerberg built a whole cryptocurrency that he's trying to launch, and so
Right.
I sort of feel like they're very well aware of what they're doing. They know about open source. They know about the privacy concerns. And I mean, yeah, you're right. There's tons of short-term revenue with surveillance. Long-term, though, I think it's a dead end. And ultimately, the users, once there are viable alternatives, the mass migrations can happen on the internet very quickly now. They can happen in days. It's all about the influencers, the biggest content brands.
Yeah, I
They
mean,
can
look at Fox News to Newsmax.
unbelievable, like probably a drop of a shift of millions of eyeballs in days, just because of people, like ideology and philosophy. I mean, it's sort of like that people have these emotional reactions to different networks, and maybe that's justified, maybe it's not justified, but the point is that viral events can occur very quickly. And so I think that it's very risky for these big networks to not be on the ethics bandwagon. I had a really cool conversation with this group that we might work with called Ethical Ads, by the guys who created the Read the Docs open source documentation project. And they're doing something very similar to what we're doing with like non-surveillance based ads and like, the Brave browser. And like there's a number of apps that are popping up that are taking sort of much more of a long-term view. And, like the DuckDuckGo search engine, they're actually not open source, but at least they're privacy focused. So it's starting to be that there's an alternative option for, the major functionalities online. And it's going to take another decade, but I do think that shifts of millions of users are already starting to happen. Like we got 300,000 users signed up in June from Thailand because they were pissed at privacy practices at Twitter and like this revolving door between their government and Twitter with takedowns and whatnot. So, and then a bunch of journalists signed up on Minds because they want more digital rights. So, and we've seen these types of events happen ever since we started, and it's just going to keep happening. So we're not necessarily, we're just focused on the product, making the UX as good as all those, slick surveillance apps. And then, eventually it's an inevitability to me whether or not it's us, it's going to be a group of apps that inevitably emerge to be competitive with the top closed source networks. And all you have to do is look at history to see that's happened. I mean, it happened with Linux, the operating system, open source, just absolutely took over the market. Everybody uses Linux now. They're not using proprietary servers and operating systems. It happened with Firefox, open source fully. Happened with Wikipedia, totally open source encyclopedia. Like, what happened to Encarta? When was the last time you put in the Encarta CD into your computer? So, Bitcoin, it's happening with crypto in general. It's eating the monetary system. So it's happening in social as well. So, that's really exciting to me. And it's just like natural market forces at work, more in the interest of the users. So, that being said, I totally understand that, like, it's not easy being a huge social network. You get overrun with tons of real disinfo, misinfo, insane content. It is wild to try to drive that ship. And so, and this is what you guys are really good at, is trying to facilitate the conversations. But so you have like micro conversations and then the macro conversation that's happening on the networks, but they're very similar. And I honestly think it's a similar strategy should be taken on both levels.
So what role do you think the government should have in regulating big tech? Because obviously there's competing considerations between free speech and conglomeration and monopolies, because for every Wikipedia there's also an Amazon, right? And these massive companies that make it almost impossible for smaller networks and smaller companies to compete. So do you think the government should play a role in trying to A, level the playing field, and B, actually regulate the companies' approaches to their terms of service?
It really depends on the exact legislation and what that would look like. I think there are some opportunities where it could be useful. I mean, Google's getting sued right now by the DOJ and
right.
On search, and they're investigating all of them. And I don't think that breaking up companies in the 21st century is really the same as it used to be. So I don't necessarily think like separating search out as a new country, or basically a country, as a new company from Alphabet, is necessarily going to accomplish that much. I think that a lot of it has to do with transparency. And this is the conversation that's not happening. I mean, with Section 230 and all of this talk about speech on social networks, like Section 230 actually is misinterpreted commonly. It actually does give networks the ability to curate. It doesn't require that they, are 100% free speech. So that's a little bit of a misconception that some people think. There's a phrase in Section 230 which talks about good faith moderation, which is a weird phrase to have in a law, first of all, because it's like, what is good faith?
Very subjective.
Very subjective. And it's very clear that there is bias in these algorithms. I don't think it's necessarily a left-right issue. It does seem to disproportionately affect the right, but it does affect the left as well. Particularly anti-establishment progressives who are seeing a lot of censorship on Facebook and Google, and I know a lot of them personally. And so, any kind of fringe ideas are at risk. And so I don't know.
And so where do you draw the line at Minds when it comes to content moderation? Because I know that you guys prioritize free speech, but I imagine there are certain limits where you would have to remove or flag content? How do you make those decisions?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we have a moderation team, and we're taking down a fair amount of content. To be honest, particularly like malicious spam and like illegal copyright stuff. Like we typically follow First Amendment ethos, but it's not like spam is covered in the First Amendment. It's not like malicious harassment is necessarily covered, and so we do take extreme like trolling and basically abusive use of the technology down, but we don't necessarily, like, if someone has a racist belief or an extreme belief or one of these types of situations, like the data and evidence actually shows, based on what we've compiled, that banning those users and content actually amplifies the problem and causes them to get more extreme, feel like they're victims. It justifies their beliefs. And like, we partnered with Daryl Davis, who joined our advisory board to help us build the de-radicalization strategy through civil discourse. So we're actually, building chat rooms and talking to people with different beliefs. And, this
And for those who don't know, Daryl Davis, right, is a Black man who has embarked on this mission to de-radicalize members of the KKK and other white supremacists through direct engagement and conversation, correct?
Yep. Yeah. And he has successfully de-radicalized over 200 members of the KKK. And he would actually say that he didn't, that they did, that they de-radicalized themselves by talking to him. And so the philosophy isn't to try to like force someone to change their mind. I think that we know psychologically that's not typically a useful or successful tactic. When you feel like someone's trying to force you down some sort of idea, you don't want to. There's a reaction that occurs, and so he just tries to listen to people, even befriends them, carries on a dialogue for a few years, and honestly, there just comes a point where they're like, it doesn't make sense anymore. I'm done. Like, you can't. And so his whole approach is to listen, and because they don't usually want to hear what he has to say right away. They want to try to push information on him, so he absorbs that and he listens as much as he can. Usually the listeners are the best, are
persuaders.
The best. Yeah, absolutely. So, it's not necessarily a one-to-one translation from physical world, real life conversations to digital. It's not as easy. Now, he does engage with a lot of people through email and whatnot, and it has been successful to a degree. So, we're working on this chat widget that we're going to be rolling out next year, where basically anyone with, whether it's a mental health issue or anyone having sort of extreme ideas, or anyone who just wants to engage with someone who is on the other side of the spectrum from them, can do that. And so you kind of go in, you let us know like which category you would fall into, and ultimately human connection is what changes minds. And so facilitating those conversations, connecting people who do want to reach out to someone on the other side, whether, it's not even necessarily extreme ideology, at this point in the country, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, but like, people, even just regular Democrats and Republicans, can't even have a conversation. So
yeah, I mean, it definitely starts at the human level. I mean, you could have people who disagree on 90% of things, but if they have a relationship and a baseline level of trust, they can find ways to discuss and work together on 10%. And the same holds true. You could have people who actually agree on the majority of issues, but because of the polarization and because of the reflexive vilification that's become so normalized, it leads to the dysfunction and further degradation of public discourse and ripping of the social fabric. And that's what we've been working on at Braver Angels, starting with these models for what was initially in-person workshops and debates, and has since, accelerated by COVID, gone online. And you do lose some of the power of face-to-face and intimacy, but you also reach people who probably wouldn't be interested in going to a face-to-face workshop. They might feel awkward, or they might feel uncomfortable, but maybe joining a Braver Angels debate on Zoom, and they can turn off their video if they want, that can become an entry point. So in some ways, moving online actually lowers the barrier to entry. I think social media is a bit of a more challenging beast in some ways, because social media has become such a cesspool of tribalism and groupthink and negative partisanship, so that your identity is formed around what you're in opposition to, instead of like what your actual values and beliefs are. And I think finding ways to allow for that cross engagement on social media is difficult, but it is possible. And I think that the getting rid of the algorithms that dominate Facebook and Twitter is sort of a key first step. But just to turn back to content moderation, the last thing I wanted to ask about in that arena is sort of like purposeful disinformation and misinformation, right? So, Twitter had gotten a lot of criticism from the left for, allowing President Trump to tweet things that are demonstrably untrue. And I think what they ultimately settled on was, well, we're not going to take down his tweets, but we are going to flag them. We're going to, basically put up a message that says, this message hasn't been verified, or I've seen YouTube underneath videos that allege widespread voter fraud. They just have a message that's like, the Associated Press has called the election for Joe Biden. How would you deal with that on Minds, right? So if President Trump had an account on Minds.com, and he was posting things, that said the election was stolen, that he actually won, sort of sowing this doubt in the minds of tens of millions of Americans who believe Trump when he says the election was stolen from him, and the consequences of that for democracy and basic government function. How would you guys, to put you on the spot, handle something like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that how Facebook, YouTube, Twitter are handling it is not correct. I think that it's maybe halfway there. The problem with it is that it's their fact-checking networks are very isolated. And so it's not to say, basically, it seems like a very centralized process for fact checking. I completely agree with the idea of on certain posts or users showing community context. So, and alerts for certain information, but the methodology for gathering that rating on the content, or whatever sort of the context, the little alert is saying, I think that they're doing that completely irresponsibly, in a way that is further polarizing the world. So, what's important, I think most people would be able to agree on, is that we want to know facts, and we want to have reliable experts and sort of a consensus mechanism for who the experts are in different fields and categories, so that and publications and whatnot, and so that when you click on that alert for an election issue or whatever it is, that you're not just, I don't think you should necessarily be told what to think. I think that because for instance with election fraud, clearly Trump is being manipulative, but to say that election fraud doesn't exist, and I'm not even talking about like this election, take any election, there are points which are worthwhile to consider on both sides of that debate. So what you would want to do is have citations and context ranked by some sort of decentralized reputation score, so that experts in the field can actually duke it out. And we can, as a user interfacing with that alert, go in and say, oh, okay, so these researchers and publications have, provided this information, and these ones have provided this. There, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter are not showing you the debate. And I don't think that the facts should, in that alert, the score of the different opinions should clearly show, it'd be like 90%, of the experts say this is not voter fraud. 10%.
So it's like a truthometer or something.
Yes, exactly. But it's not it's a truthometer on both sides. So the network is not saying this is BS. That makes no sense to me. It's like, how do these networks honestly think that they are solving problems by telling all of these Trump supporters that, like, not even giving any of their thoughts any credibility? They're just saying, look, the AP says this. Now, I completely agree. The AP has tons of credibility and should be a monstrously weighted opinion. So, I think they're all doing it wrong. And but at least, they're sort of on the path. And I don't necessarily think it's malicious. I think that they're just responding in the best way that they can. I do think that they're a little bit afraid to show the full spectrum of ideas about, various issues, because it's super, there's controversy. Like, you want to talk about COVID, like perfect example we see tons of those fact checking things about COVID, even to the point where like stuff was getting banned that, was like all these doctors saying this. And like, so it's like, which doctors? I think we agree that there's nuance here. So, and typically every conversation has nuance. So yeah.
Well, it's all about drawing the line. And I think that one of the issues, at least when it comes to Trump's brand of populism, is that in some ways it rejects expertise entirely. So, if you're told, well, the top 1,000 scientists have, 979 of them say that climate change is man-made and real, they'll reject that on his face, because that's just sort of another example of whether it's, the elites or the deep state or big tech. And it almost becomes self-justifiable, which I think has been a neat trick of Trump. Like, if experts say it's so, then it must not be so.
Right, right.
And that's obviously something that's tricky to navigate. And so, how have you seen these kind of political issues play out in the public discussions happening on Minds.com? What is the current uh, ideological composition of the platform? Because in researching you before this podcast, there's stories from 2018 and 2019 in Vice, that say Minds.com has become a haven for neo Nazis.
Right.
How have you guys dealt with that? Is it a very sort of laissez-faire approach, or do you try to sort of get as many different perspectives in the door as you can?
Yeah, that Vice piece is like this. I spoke with them for hours, outlining our what we're trying to do, and they just didn't want to hear that we're trying to have a nuanced conversation, and that there is data that shows that these censorship policies can have drastic effects on global consciousness and polarization. They just didn't want to hear it. They didn't actually give a fair shake. Most publications give us a fair shake. We've been covered super favorably by in The Economist, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Wired, TechCrunch, all of them. Like 95% of our press coverage is, I feel like most of the writers have at least have listened to what we're trying to accomplish. There is a certain group of people who aren't willing to understand that, Daryl's strategy and this sort of alternative approach. And they're going to write those pieces, and they're going to try to, reject the nuance and polarize our position. But I think that it's a requirement for us to, we have to, I don't claim that our strategy is necessarily the ultimate strategy, but I know that we need to A/B test these. I'm trying to get this focus in, but it's not working. We need to A/B test mainstream social media content policy versus a policy like ours, which is not just laissez-faire, let it go Wild West. That's not what we're doing. We are trying to engage people, create a tone and an environment where people do feel safe to express themselves, which is, I think, very important for like ground zero of discourse. And I'm just confident in the hypothesis. I think over the next decade, we're going to start gathering data, understanding what is our de-radicalization rate. How many people who have signed up for Minds, were maybe in an extreme category, or were on the right and moved left, or were on the left and moved right. We want to start getting volunteer data on that, and then let's compare that with the mainstream networks, because guess what?
Absolutely.
I'm quite confident that their de-radicalization rates are going to be very low, because guess what? You can't de-radicalize somebody that you just threw off the platform.
Mm-hmm. Well, and even people who, it just seems like, based on my own anecdotal experience, people become radicalized when they are using Twitter and Facebook as their primary instruments of political discussion, especially older Americans. If you're spending 4 hours a day talking politics on Facebook, you're probably becoming more radicalized, not less.
Yeah. And, based on our last conversation, I think that we have a responsibility to clarify and better frame the context that we're trying to foster. So for instance, like when someone signs up to Minds, I don't think we're necessarily doing a better job of making it very, or I don't think we're necessarily doing a great job of fully explaining like the mission, which can be a little bit overwhelming to a new user. Like, okay, I was just trying to join this alternative social network. Didn't know I was trying to like change the world and like change people's minds about like ideology. So I think you need to be a little bit careful not to be like too heavy-handed, but you're right that on mainstream social, the context is like, I just want to argue about and like get my ideas onto other people, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to I want to join this site and have a conversation with someone that I disagree with. I want to join this site and actually try to listen. And so if I see something that is offensive to me, that I understand there's a larger project going on here where we're trying to diffuse global tension and polarization, and that and honestly, that is such that's just a skill we all need to learn outside of social media, regardless of what site we're on, so that when we're browsing through, like, we're staying calm, because it's like
Mm-hmm.
bad for your health to just be getting stressed out reading social media.
Oh, yeah. And I think that people's ideologies are increasingly tied to their identity. So when they come across a piece of content they find offensively disagreeable, they feel like it's a personal attack.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a hard thing to break through. When it comes to identity, people don't have to verify their identity, I presume, on Minds. You can just sort of
No.
make an anonymous account, right?
Yep.
Yeah. And so as your platform gets bigger, do you think there would ever be a need for certain kinds of verification, or you could sort of leave it all anonymous?
I think what we're ultimately going for is for people to be able to control who they're interacting with and who can interact with them. So I think it's totally justified to say, like, I don't want to interact with anonymous people, because it is true that anonymity, probably does work hand in hand with, there's probably more anonymous trolls than non-anonymous trolls, but there are non-anonymous trolls, aka Trump.
Right.
Some people are fully confident to be who they are and be totally out there, and that's okay. That's their right too. But I think that as a user, you shouldn't necessarily have to see something that offends you, and you shouldn't have to be subject to getting comments from anonymous accounts, but you may want to. A lot of people want to, and I think that should be in your control. And we should do our best to give people pathways to expand their bubble, so that
Mm-hmm.
they can break out of their echo chamber. Now, we got to be careful what we wish for, because there's a lot of talk about breaking echo chambers, but a lot of the people saying that there's all these echo chambers, do they really want to break their own echo chamber?
Mm-hmm.
Are the people who are preaching about echo chambers willing to break their own echo chamber? And maybe it's true that certain echo chambers are, like an echo chamber of nonsense and lies is probably, negative, and probably an echo chamber of, loving content is going to be good. So,
Right.
an echo chamber is sort of like just a content funnel, and it's, it's not so simple. Like, someone who is very justified in their beliefs and thinks that they're like the righteous, ethical person, they don't necessarily want to go talk to a Hillary supporter or a Trump supporter. So
Right.
that's the hardest thing, to find that humanity and be willing to want to have that conversation. It might be too much to ask.
Yeah. Well, it is for some people, but on the other hand, people are exhausted and recognize that the current system is not working. And so I do think there's appetite for something different. And I don't think that any of these alternative social media outlets have really been able to break through at the level that I think you hope they can. So I guess my last question is, in an ideal world, where would you like minds.com to be in 5 years? And what are the steps that you think you guys need to take to get there?
Well, to go back to what we were talking about the experts and the scientific consensus and whatnot, I think that that is what's interesting to me because, like, for instance, on climate, you hear I think that most people obviously agree that there's scientific consensus on climate change. Let's do a better job at displaying that consensus, rather than just hearing this sort of almost it's like a meme at this point, just like scientific consensus climate change. Like, though the numbers of the expert debate should be clear. Like, why isn't that list of scientists more clear on social media? Like, so if you're on a
Right.
post about climate, like, should see those thousands of scientists and studies like that you can easily reference. And the same around every issue. And so, if Trump thinks that, all the experts are, full of it, I just think that the information and the data transparently displayed is the key, because then the information is speaking for itself, and we can use different social graphs and trust voting systems to build this sort of consensus around who the experts are, and like what the more accurate content is. It's not like this is an impossible problem to solve. So, even though there's slight risk in, for instance, around a COVID post displaying some of the controversial studies, so you have like all the studies about all, how dangerous COVID is. Obviously, most people agree on that. But then I think where the networks are getting it wrong is that they seem to be unwilling to show the controversial content that may, have some evidence in it. It's not like it's completely throw out the window information, but it seems like on those cases, they don't want to clearly articulate the debate. And it's obvious there's a debate, otherwise we wouldn't be seeing all this mayhem on social media of everyone freaking out about it. So what I hope to do better is we are building these sort of rating systems in context alerts. That is a project that we're actively working on, to sort of have our more nuanced response to how social media should attack this information. So, like, we don't want to take it down, but we definitely want to provide context. So, and then I guess I would say that we want as balanced a community as possible. I mean, we honestly, our first growth wave was mostly progressives back in like 2015, sort of around the NSA spying scandals with Edward
Right.
Snowden. And that's where, our initial core community came. And then, like, when Trump got in office, obviously, the free speech issue started to become more associated with the right, which to me is just a travesty. And it's really it's sad that free speech has become politicized, and because it is progressives, Democrats, Republicans, libertarians, there's subsets of all of those groups that believe in free speech, and for good reason. So, but we just need to frame it properly. And yeah, I don't know. I'm just surprised that no big network is really stepping up and driving the conversation in a more balanced way. It's like, it's not, with what you guys are doing as well. It sort of seems crazy to me that there's not leadership trying to depolarize. Like, do you get the impression that any of these big companies are really trying to depolarize?
I don't think so. I think that everyone right now is sort of holding their breath until Joe Biden gets inaugurated and hoping that removing Trump from office will somehow solve this problem, which I think is naive. A, because Trump is not going away, and B, because this speaks to something more fundamental in human nature. And I think what we found at Braver Angels is that a lot of people are looking for community and relationships and meaning, and they're finding the illusion of those things on social media. But the experiences they're having there are actually, ironically, reducing their capacity to find those kinds of things. And so people's emotions are more and more driven by hate and cynicism and fear, instead of hope and love and opportunity. And so I think, in a way, we at Braver Angels, and also, to some extent, you at Minds, we almost have to be kind of polarized about depolarization, because I think sometimes people hear, the efforts of, civil discourse or open source, and their reaction is kind of like, oh, that's cute, or, isn't that nice? But actually, it's serious, and we need to have courage and have kind of some bite and edge to what we're doing, in order to provide a viable alternative. And so that's, one of the reasons that we changed our name from Better Angels to Braver Angels, is that this sort of work, it's not just about empathy and respect and all that. It's about the courage to, absorb some of the heat that you're going to get from the other side, but also withstand the judgment and criticism that you're going to get from folks in your own quote unquote tribe, who are going to accuse you of, being a sellout, or, legitimizing bigotry. And I'm sure you guys get that same level of criticism. And it does take courage to try to persevere if you really do believe that the end result of your work is going to be a net positive for social good.
I mean, that is just, I resonate so deeply with that, because, this idea of legitimizing bigotry, it really kills me when I'll see an article like that one from Vice, or, the couple of those that have come out, and I'm just like, wow, that's just so not representative of what we're doing. And when you sort of carry this burden of, in some sense, standing up for people that you disagree with so strongly, I mean, that is a burden. And, it does take courage to do it. And, for our team and, our community, I know that, they also carry that burden as well, because it's not easy. It's so much easier to just stay with your tribe and not reach out. And so, and it makes it hard. I mean, it makes it harder to grow as well. When we allow the full spectrum of content. I mean, like we have content moderation guidelines, but stuff still, there is stuff there that, it's a small percentage of content, but like if people want to find it, they can. And, the vast majority of our community is like artists, musicians, journalists, this kind of stuff. But, people over associate the content with the network, and it's not the same. Actually, so yeah, I think that is the breakthrough that people need to have. and the catharsis that you can experience in terms of, feeling like, you're connecting with people is so much higher when it's someone that you weren't expecting to get along with. It's like it's a totally different, almost like transcendent level of connection that you can experience. And like when both people are really listening. And, I even know, like in family conversations, like we all have the family members that are just, a disaster to talk to. But when you can break through and like feel like they're listening to you and you're listening to them, that is it. That is the experience that we want to try to engineer in like a systematic way and help facilitate. So yeah, man, it's been great. Great chatting. And like, I would love, through the new messenger system, we will have video capabilities as well. So it's not just going to be text. And yeah, we should, see what we can come up with putting some conversations together.
Definitely. Well, I think that's a perfect place to end this conversation. Bill, great to have you on the podcast. For our listeners, go check out minds.com. Whether you're just simply exhausted by Facebook, or you're intrigued by this conversation, or you want to see how the approach we take at Braver Angels might be replicated in the world of social media, go check it out. It's minds.com. And shoot me an email. Let me know how you feel about this conversation. Take compliments, criticisms, suggestions for future guests. You can email me, media@braverangels.org. And until then, until the next episode, see you later. Thank you so much, Bill.
Thanks. Yeah. Find me minds.com/Ottman, and would love to chat.
Cool. Peace.